All right, good afternoon and welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. Back again for our bi-weekly events, Central Florida Freethought community. We're live on Zoom and streaming to YouTube as well. So thanks for joining us however you are. Even if you're in the future right now and haven't watched us yet, we want you to feel welcome. In just a minute, I'll introduce our special guest. But before we begin, I just want to remind you that you can join us on Zoom for these events. To get that information, you need to log into our Meetup group. You need to join us on Meetup because we want to, for the security and consistency and the quality of our meetings, we want to make sure that we have a kind of a gateway, and that gateway is Meetup. Meetup's a great platform. It functions very well for us, and it makes sure that we can lightly vet the people that participate. So that's why we don't have these logins on Facebook. So join us on Meetup if you want. Otherwise, you can see us on YouTube. If you follow our page, you'll get notifications when we have events like this one, and we're doing these every couple of weeks. Look for more events to be announced soon. We've taken what was a monthly in-person educational event and made it into a bi-weekly online event with amazing people from around the US that we would not have seen in the Winter Park University Club. These folks have some great things to share that are of interest to you, but not every topic is going to be up your alley, and that's okay. We've got a broad range of focus across the spectrum of issues that are of interest to humanists. And we'll continue to stream these events on YouTube. We'll continue to have them on Zoom until it's safe to get together again. So look for us on social media at CFL Freethought. Of course, our weekly social events called Freethought Cafes are still continuing, as well as secular women events, all online to help keep you connected. Again, find all that information on meetup.com/CFL Freethought. And you can also find us on Facebook as well at CFL Freethought. But again, you do need to join the Meetup to join the Zoom meetings. If you're with us on Zoom today, we ask that you keep your camera off and your microphone off. And the reason for the cameras off today is because Rachel and I are going to have a bit of a conversation. It's not going to be just a straight presentation with her highlighted. So we'll both be on screen and we'll be dialoguing about social justice and humanism. Also, be sure your microphone stays on mute. We'll help you with that if needed. Those of you in the Zoom meeting can find the chat option available at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, just tap your screen and you'll see several options there, and chat is one of them. Chat is where we do want you to ask questions today. If you're on YouTube, you can put those into the live stream comments and we'll get to those and we'll try to throw those into the mix. And with that, I'll introduce Rachel. Rachel is the Director of Policy and Social Justice at the American Humanist Association, as well as the Center for Freethought Equality. And that's why I first met Rachel, since I serve on the advisory board there. And a quick aside, you may know about the American Humanist Association, but the Center for Freethought Equality is a much younger organization with a different focus. And in case we don't talk more about it today, I just want to be sure to mention that the center is the advocacy and political arm of the American Humanist Association. Conducts lobbying activities, endorses and financially supports candidates when it's possible for those candidates that are interested in working towards a secular government. And the mission of the Freethought Equality Fund it's a political action committee. It is to, quote, change the face of American politics and to achieve equality by increasing the number of open humanists and atheists in office at all levels of government. So for the American Humanist Association and the Center for Freethought Equality, Rachel advocates for inclusive public policy that ensures humanist values are front and center in the minds of legislators. But not all endorsed candidates in the pack are atheists or humanists, but it's refreshing to see that there are dozens and dozens out there across the country who are. So I encourage you to take a look at the website for the Center for Freethought Equality and its sister website, the Freethought Equality Fund, freethought-equality.org. So back to Rachel. She has background in national politics, advocacy, as well as federal and state level strategic communications. She's got a master's degree in theological studies from Harvard Divinity, where she conducted research on religion's role in stigma and public policy. So welcome to the CFFC, Rachel.
Thanks, David. I'm excited to be here.
So you are in the DC area. You live and work in that area, probably in the same room nowadays, right?
Yeah, right now I've stolen my partner's office, but yeah, I've been in DC for about 10 years now.
Okay, fantastic. And so you're not a lobbyist, right? We have a lobbyist that's different than what you do, right?
So I am our lobbyist.
Oh, you are? Okay, gotcha.
So
yep.
It can be, it's newer. So Matt Balger was our lobbyist. He was my boss. I adored working with him, and he actually left for a new opportunity last year, and I took on his role. And so, yeah, I am our lobbyist in DC.
Okay, gotcha. I remember Matt. Yeah, Matt and I did a presentation at the AHA a few years ago, and it's great that I'm confused about the different roles of all the people at AHA. That means we're doing a lot of work, and I can't keep up with it, so that's a positive thing. So tell us what you did before you joined the AHA, and you can take us back as far as you want, because I think a lot of your life experiences are relevant. So tell us, give us your elevator speech or kind of your rundown on why you're with AHA and how you came to serve the humanist communities out there.
Yeah, so I'll stick to professional life. I don't think y'all need to hear about my childhood. So I have been in DC for 10 years now. I came to DC after working on a few campaigns. Was hired by a communications consulting firm where I coordinated and eventually managed nationwide advocacy campaigns. Basically, how do you communicate to an audience? How do you educate? How do you educate lawmakers? How do you educate constituencies on a bunch of different issues? And after a few years there, I ended up managing a nationwide campaign to ensure that low-income people with HIV and AIDS had access to treatment. And it was all through the national Ryan White program, which is implemented on the state level. So I got really involved in state level advocacy, which I think brought together a lot of my interests in religion, policy, and stigma, because a lot of the folks in these coalitions that we were building on the state level were coming from religious groups doing absolutely amazing work. And I think in my activism part of my life, I've always looked to religious communities as taking the lead on a lot of the issues of our time. I mean, even before that, any black and white photo from back in the day, right? You've got some minister or pastor right front and center. And while I've always appreciated that work, it has also mildly frustrated me to not see humanists as visibly engaged. And that isn't to say that we weren't engaged. We absolutely have been. But I think I've taken a lot of my cues from religious communities, which is how I ended up at Divinity School. I think if you're going to study religion, you have to do it around religious folks. And I was proudly atheist. There were a few humanists on campus. We actually started a humanist group. And I did a lot of research on stigma. I studied masculinity. I studied LGBTQ issues. I kept working on HIV work. And ultimately, I was doing research on church responses to HIV in San Francisco in the 1990s, before I saw the job opening at AHA for a social justice coordinator. And it was just, I don't know, it just felt like a ridiculous opportunity that I did not think was real for a little while. And that's how I ended up as our social justice coordinator. And then, as I said, I think I have straddled a few roles. When Matt left after a year, I became our lobbyist. And that's kind of what brought me to AHA.
All right, fantastic. Well, and so can you talk about like your day-to-day? And I realize that day-to-day may be very different, week-to-week may be very different, but kind of give us a sense for what our membership dues and donations are doing to help, keep the gears turning there, and how you play a part in that.
Yeah, so I think my day-to-day straddles two roles. And I think it was, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about our social justice work in a bit, but I think it is meaningful that after Matt left, who was just our director of legislative affairs, the title was changed to director of policy and social justice, because we've been working really hard to infuse social justice through all of our work and kind of raise it up literally through the staff hierarchy, right? How we're structured has changed. And so what I do every day is oversee our social justice work. We have a wonderful social justice assistant, Margie, who coordinates the work of our 4 social justice alliances, which I'm sure we'll also talk about in a little bit. So I help her with that. I help out with a lot of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and kind of how we model that work and our social justice work internally. I say, all problems are growth opportunities. And so I'm very candid about the work we do internally to make ourselves more inclusive, more equitable as an organization. And then I'm also lobbying. I meet weekly with the the ambassador at large for international religious freedom at the State Department, representing the voices of humanists and non-theists. I'm also talking with congressional staff members, probably too often. Before COVID, it was, I was on the Hill, I'd say 3 out of the 5 days a week. And now I'm at least Zooming with folks almost as often. And that's kind of my day-to-day.
Right. Now, 2 things came up there. One is like, what if we were, BCE, before the COVID era? I'm trying to popularize that, by the way. BCE, okay. What was your time in the office versus time traveling, and now time traveling as obviously on the Hill versus flying around the country, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was pretty funny, folks. I was usually in the office 2 days a week, full time, and then other than that, I would be running in, grabbing a suit jacket or a pair of shoes that I absolutely forgot under my desk, and then running back out to the Hill because I actually live on the Hill. So there's some days where they won't see me at the office at all, and I intentionally try to schedule meetings. Like if I'm going to be going to the Hill and taking that what I consider expensive ride over, which is like $6, but I think as a nonprofit mindset, every Uber trip matters.
That's right. So, yeah. So when you say live on the Hill, I think it's surprising to some people who don't realize Capitol Hill isn't just where the Capitol is. There's an entire hill there, and you live on the same hill as the Capitol.
I do.
Not in the basement somewhere.
No, yes. I live in a neighborhood, right? You can actually see the Washington Monument from my window.
That's great. It's tooling around Washington, D.C. is a lot of fun. And not everything is as close together as you would like, but it's close together enough for most healthy people to be able to see it or roll to it if you need to get some wheels to do it. So that's great. And then, so how effective have you become, or less effective have you become during COVID? I think that's a curiosity to many of us who have transitioned to working from home or continue to do that.
Yeah, I think just the way we work has changed, right? And I think that's true for anyone in any job. So I think we've become more effective in some ways and less effective in others. I really see myself as kind of grip and grin lobbyist. I think do my best work meeting folks and building relationships, which has obviously been a lot more challenging when you're trying to build those relationships over a phone call. But I do think that our coalitions have gotten a lot stronger. I come from a coalition building background, so this isn't new to me. So we had a meeting with Senator Menendez's staff a few weeks ago, and normally maybe I'd go in alone or bring 2 people with me. We rolled deep, as I like to say to that meeting. There were about 12 different organizations represented on that call. And I think that, and then using letters. So advocacy letters are really important. So if you see like 200 social justice organizations sign on to letter urging Congress to pass this bill, we've relied on a lot more of those that we also then bring into meetings and say, hey, we're not only representing ourselves here, we're representing all of these other communities who agree that this change needs to happen.
Right, and I think we see the same thing whenever we're writing legal letters for local issues or even national issues, is when you've got more people you can point to as stakeholders, whether those be voters or donors or whatever. It really increases your impact. Now we've got a long way to go before we're a coalition of Christians, but still we have a lot of partners in our advocacy. And I don't want to steal any thunder from you, but I do have to say most social justice issues are separation of church and state at their root, right? I mean, do you want to talk about that for a minute and how we can align with so many of these groups simply because of the separation between religion and government?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah. So when I started, I think one of our objectives was to bring our social justice work more into our policy work. And so we got involved with Planned Parenthood's small lobby. And they, one of the folks who've been around for much longer than I have was like, oh my gosh, where have y'all been? Like, y'all were with us at the beginning in this conversation, right? When, Planned Parenthood started small lobby, the American Humanist Association was in those meetings. And so I think our longevity in movements is really kind of a feather in our hat, in our cap in that way. And I think we're valued because we do talk about things as a constitutional or separation of church and state perspective. So, I've been asked to come into meetings and like, hey, can you explain this perspective? Because I think it's important for members to be aware of. I'll say that when we're starting to talk about vaccines right now, right, we've got folks who we don't normally work with on vaccination issues who just know that that's something that we have a stake in as a separation of church and state issue, and religious exemptions for vaccinations that, I didn't even have to go to folks. I actually had Senator Hassan and Senator Hirono the other day be like, hey, Rachel, y'all work on vaccines, don't you? And I just was like kind of thrown back that folks are making links in their minds that, I don't even need to walk in and make that link for them.
Yeah, we're becoming more relevant, not simply because we're there, although I think that's a huge part of it, but because people understand where our values lie. right? And I think, and I find that it's unfortunate in my mind that there's not more discussion, and I'm not in those discussions, right? But I don't think there's much discussion, or I think we'd hear about it after the fact, about how atheism, humanism, separation of church and state, those things that align almost all atheists, which aren't necessarily talked about as like the American Atheist says, is when civil rights are at risk, atheists show up, right? I love that poster, and I wish we saw more of those. But I think there's not enough people acknowledging that, and I think there's the stigma, right? But I think there's also ignorance of what our values are, and I really appreciate you and other organizations. And speaking of those other organizations that are doing this too, I mean, I'm seeing, and I'm wondering about the value of this as someone who wants to make sure we're spending our money wisely in the movement, is we've got lobbyists in FFRF, we've got lobbyists at SCA, we've got lobbyists in AHA through the Center for Freethought Equality. So talk about your collaboration with those folks, because I surely hope you're working together as best you can with them.
Oh yeah, we absolutely are. So we meet at least monthly as a group. Like we're over communicating. I think I've actually gotten 4 emails from FFRF this weekend alone on the death of Justice Ginsburg and how we're all going to work together moving forward, starting Monday. So yeah, I think the work that all those groups do is really important. And I think we all lead in different areas, right? CFI leads on vaccines. So as soon as the senators asked me about, what we're doing on vaccines, before I even opened my mouth, right, I checked in with Jason at CFI and was like, hey, we're hearing mumblings about this. Do you want to take this on? I'm totally happy to take a back seat, because I do think that coalitions work best when, there's no egos in the way, right? So I'm not trying to just claim all this work. We're a coalition. We work really well together. And by recognizing which organization leads on which issues, we're able to be a lot more effective.
Yeah, when you're specialists, right? I mean, you can't do everything as well as if you had specialists involved. And this is why healthcare has evolved the way it has. And I think I'm glad lobbying has evolved that way for your team. So, what about state level lobbying? I know you can't speak for those other organizations, but what can AHA and you and the gears of the organization that you can pull on help for state level issues? Because that comes up for us a lot. And I think that's what should be happening, right? We should be watching the state while you're watching the US Capitol, but how can we get help from you and others when we need it for that?
I love that question. So the American Humanist Association in January just invested in some really fancy new software that I call my new favorite toy. We have Humanist Action Headquarters. And if I get a call from someone in Kansas, let's say, which I did earlier this year, hey, we have an abortion issue happening right now that I really need the AHA to activate on, I sent out an action alert to all our members in Kansas. I sent out, we got involved on social media. We reached out to partners. American Atheists, again, in terms of specialties, American Atheists works really well, and they really focus on the state level. And so calling them like, hey, have you heard about this? How can we be most helpful? And so I think we have national reach in terms of building hey, have you called the governor yet on this? And it was actually effective, right? We struck down that constitutional amendment. The AHA doesn't take full credit for that, but I like to think that we were a small part of that effort. And so if you're ever seeing issues that you feel like we need to be aware of, sending me an email, giving me a call of, hey, I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, because odds are, frankly, I haven't. You're going to hear about things a lot faster than we are. And so giving me that heads up, we can build some infrastructure nationally to make sure that we're getting the word out.
That's great. And I think we may not be there yet, but I hope that we come to a place soon. And I think we probably are well past this when it comes to legal issues of separation between religion and government, right? We've got inboxes with, I can name 7 national organizations and a couple in my state here in Florida that I could basically email all of these people and have 8 attorneys or more, if the issue is important enough, all working on the same issue. And that's not the best way to do this. And I fear that with all these wonderful organizations who do have a good niche, right? I mean, everybody's picked out their territory in the movement as far as what they focus on. It's really clear if you've paid attention to what these groups are doing. There's only a little bit of overlap, in the non-theism part, but in the advocacy part, they're really good at advocating for specific issues. And I'm sure the lobbyists in those organizations may not align perfectly, but when you mentioned vaccines and CFI, I'm like, duh, of course, that's what you would expect. But how can we be sure that there's not 4 or 5 lobbyists or advocacy people or policy people working on the same state issue? Or for, stepping outside of your role, how can we make sure there's not 8 attorneys working on the same issue? But we're not talking about, you're not meeting with people every day. And I know the attorneys don't meet with everybody every day, although they do have good relationships. Talk about that if you'd like. Maybe that's not a bone for you to pick, but it just seems like something we could do better in some ways. And maybe we are, and I just don't know it.
So I think I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask,
Okay.
but I think it's not a bad thing that we are we are at times working on the same thing, because I think, like you said, we're doing it from different angles. I think to make sure that we're not being redundant, like we talked about earlier, is just communication is key. And I think sometimes the urgency of the matter means that we're not as intentional about it. And I think that is always to our detriment, right? I think taking that second to pause and say, okay, who would naturally be working on this? And then reaching out to their office is just something I think all the groups, every organization needs to continue to work on.
Yeah. Now, and are you getting support for that within AHA? Are they supportive of farming out issues that are not necessarily up your alley as a expert?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not trying to speak over our legal team, but I think so. I think we do that all the time, especially like with amicus briefs. Hey, we're not the right group to work on this. We'll sign something, but maybe this is so-and-so's bailiwick.
Gotcha. Well, good. I really hope we do more of that. I mean, when we talk about the presence of local groups, there's a lot of overlap, and it's so much more the case with national groups. And something that I've been as a chapter of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as an affiliate of AHA and American Atheists, and a fan and a member and donor to the other national organizations. I don't feel like they're doing a bad job of managing this process, but I feel like with so much going on right now, I mean, the last 3.5 years have been a freaking nightmare. But it's not going to go away simply if we have a good, a change in leadership in the next few months. But I think that that's going to be an important issue, and I don't doubt that people like Nick and Annie Laurie and Dan and Roy and others aren't thinking about that. So I hope they're continuing to do that, and I can only put my plug in for that here. But I don't have doubts that it's going well. I just don't see that, right? And I certainly don't have a need to see it. So let's switch over to talk a little bit about social justice, because I think that's why most people are here. And let's start with the affirming side of this equation, because we have to talk about dissent from it, because that exists. But I don't want to dwell on that, and I want to focus on why we should do the things we do. For those people who may need a primer in why humanism and social justice go well together, what's your pitch for that?
Yeah, so I think we could totally talk about the separation of religion and government issue, but I think for me personally, and my framework for why the AHA is involved in social justice work goes back to the fact that humanism is an ethical life stance, right? And it talks about how we ought to act in the world in some way, shape, or form. And I think if we're looking toward evidence of injustice, right, I think evidence-based and compassion go hand in hand here. I think we see evidence of inequity. I think we see evidence of unequal opportunity, unequal starting points. And so I think, if you look at
you
manifesto, which some people laugh at.
You went through something really quickly. I think unequal starting points, right? For someone as steeped in this as you, I think that's probably something we should pick apart just a little bit more, and why that one statement there is real important.
Yeah. So when I started AHA, Roy handed me the book, The Color of Law, that all AHA staff had read. And I think when we're talking about social justice, we need to speak in specifics. And so the specifics of redlining, right? Who owns homes, who was able to own homes where, who accrued wealth through home ownership, right? I think that book in particular does a really good job of explaining how this day and age, we're not all starting from equal starting points in terms of wealth accumulation, in terms of living in safe areas. And so I think that touches so many different areas, right? That we could spend an entire hour, we could spend multiple days talking about unequal starting points and unequal opportunity in our country. But I also think it's really important to talk about specifics. I'm happy to talk more about redlining if that's where we want to go.
Well, I think that's a great segue. Let's talk about redlining, but I think it may be hard for people who don't, and I'm a privileged person in almost every aspect of my life, and I need to remind myself, and I appreciate when others remind me of that. But I think that for so many people, they don't see, right, from their beautiful suburban home, the injustices that are done to people who they don't know very well. So, but definitely feel free to go into redlining or elaborate on that, because I don't think we're going to convince anybody that's watching this, right? But I do think we want the people that are watching this to understand the argument, so that when people start dissenting from the idea that humanism leads to social justice, then we've got some ammunition,
Yeah, I hear that. I think one thing humanists do well, right, is we take in information. We love, like, okay, I'm a skeptic, show me the data. And so I think one of the things Color of Law, reading it many years ago now, does really well is it looks at the data. And I think one of the things that humanists can do and should do is think about, maybe, you talked about living in suburbia. Suburbia didn't just happen by accident. None of this is like natural, just building of homes in these subdivisions and streets. Looking back at your community and figuring out, was there redlining? There probably was. I think looking back at my own community where I grew up in an area that had 6 parks all run right next to each other. And when I was really little, my mom drove me by. She goes, "Oh, that's because of racism." And I didn't understand that at the time. And while reading this book and doing other research, right, I learned that angry Deerfielders in Illinois basically rioted at a city council meeting to make sure that no affordable housing went up and 6 parks went up instead. So I think the way that we can find evidence for where these social inequities occur is looking really locally, figuring out why our communities are the way they are, what's missing, right? I think it's so easy to pinpoint what's there and what we see, but it's often a lot harder to figure out why we aren't seeing what we're not seeing.
Right. And you can't see history unless you go back and look at what caused things to be the way they are now. Right. Yeah. When I look at my neighborhood and I understand a little bit of the racist past of the town that I live in, I can understand why I am where I am and why there's not very many people of color here. Right. So I get that. And I think that we can't ignore the injustices of the past. But what we've done in many ways is whitewash those. And if we haven't whitewashed them intentionally, we've ignored them because we're ashamed of them.
Yeah.
And I think it's right to be ashamed of them, but we can't ignore them from the learning that we have to do to create a just society. And there's a lot of people that out there that don't want to talk about this because they step in piles of shit every time they do. They say the wrong thing. I have pastor friends. I have some very powerful clergy people in the Orlando area that are friends of mine that are definitely afraid of talking to and about these issues, because if they use the language that they're used to, they're going to embarrass themselves and not even know it. And they'll find out later and go, "Man, I just need to stay the hell out of this." Yeah. So we've got to get uncomfortable, like you mentioned earlier. We've got to get uncomfortable, but we've got to do it with people that trust us as people of goodwill who are trying to learn, right? If we come from a privileged position and whatever that might be. And I would challenge anybody who's an atheist or a humanist or a secularist of any sort to keep in mind that oppression you feel because of atheism and your humanism is nothing compared to it if you had to have a letter on your forehead, or religious garb, or a color of skin that could be identified from a long way away. So it's hard to relate to those things. Go ahead.
No, I think that's right. I think in talking about, I'm going to stay away from this conversation because I'm going to put my foot in my mouth, or some other space. I think a big part of this is being okay with making mistakes. I make mistakes weekly, right? Like I do this work every day and I am constantly making mistakes, but I think accepting that and just being okay with that is a huge part of this work. And it's a huge part of just any kind of education, right? When you're learning math, like I'm terrible at math, but when you're learning math and as a kid, you're going to make mistakes, right? And that's something your teachers tell you. Oh, you're going to make a mistake. It's okay. You're going to keep learning. I don't know why we have such a hard time applying that. Actually, I do know, that's a lie. Why we have such a hard time applying that to our social justice work. It's because it's personal, right? Mm-hmm. It is making claims about ourselves and our own position in the world. And I think having uncomfortable conversations with those closest to you is the best place to start, right? Absolutely. Try out this vocabulary. I think in our team, right, if someone at AHA says something that might have an unintended impact, pulling them aside afterwards and being like, "Hey, I'm so glad you said this here, because this isn't a growth opportunity, this is a learning opportunity." Mm-hmm. I'm not usually that pedantic, right? But like validating when folks might say something wrong as just an opportunity to learn a new way of doing something.
Right.
if we reframe the conversation, we can get a lot farther.
Yeah, and something that I've started doing more of is when I meet someone who I know is interested and comfortable engaging in a particular subject matter relating to privilege, in that realm, I say, I want you to correct me. I want you to correct me. If you could do me a favor, don't do it while we're standing in front of 100 people. But if you don't mind, correct me so that I can make sure I benefit from my mistakes. And I want to do the same for you when it comes to atheism. So I have, pastors who are gay that are friends of mine and they're not out. And I want them to be able to communicate to me about my privilege in those regards, but also my ignorance in those regards, right? So we've all got these labels that apply to us. And in one way or another, when we walk into a new space, we're going to be a minority. And I think we don't always suffer the same consequences, and that minority status isn't quite as powerful.
Yeah. And I think one other things, and I think I actually just saw this in the comment section, is when you're being corrected, like that's also taking labor from someone, right? That's taking emotional strength sometimes, right? If I say something that, it impacts the person I'm with and they're willing to correct me on that, like that is so valuable. And I feel like coming at that from a place of appreciation rather than defensiveness is really hard, but it really, again, like can shift the way we're thinking about these conversations.
Right. When we look at, getting into trouble with language that is innocent in its intention. And I'm not talking about, complete ignorance of common decor. I'm talking about kind of minor flubs. When you make those mistakes in public, it's a very different type of public than a celebrity or a politician. So I think our fear is based on what we see out there. We see out there people coming crashing down on social media and in the world in general, in the news cycle, who do or say something wrong. And I don't think that should cause as much fear as it does, because most of us don't live in that type of life. Right? We don't live in the light that those people live in. And I think the consequences of our mistakes are going to be a lot less than those people. And I think that's probably a perspective we need to keep in mind when we think about, making those mistakes, we're not going to lose, our $1 million contract and be on the news cycle for the next week, like someone else might be. So that hopefully that's a consolation in some cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's see what we've got here. I got some more questions. So you talked about why AHA's involved in this, and I think it makes sense. What has changed in the last 6 months or longer? I mean, how long have you been there? A couple years now?
2 years.
2 years, right? So what have you seen change? And maybe it's not AHA's work that's changed, but just it's the work in itself is changing, right? Obviously, this year has been very important for the movement for Black lives, and I think that's probably been an important part of what you've been doing. But tell me about kind of the things that have been happening in your world since you got to AHA regarding social justice, because this is not your first foray into social justice, for sure.
Yeah. So I think I often use my interview as a barometer for this kind of conversation. So I walked in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, right? Like, I was really excited about it. And they asked me what I would do to change about our social justice work. Normal question. And I was basically said, we have to do the internal work first. We cannot go out talking about social justice issues if we're not willing to look inside our own community, both at headquarters, but also what it means to be part of organized humanism, with a really critical eye. I also talked a lot about specific changes that I would recommend. Really laying down, I would want our work to be resourced properly. I think where you put your money, so to follow your values. And I also said that it can't just be siloed. I think having a social justice position is not what you would normally see in social justice work, right? And so I was very nervous that all of the social justice work would be siloed in one position, and the communications department would go out and do their things, the development department would go out and do their things, the education department would go out and do their things, and just not really be connected with the social justice work. And I think we've actually gone a long way in those 2 years to make sure that we're doing all of those things. We're being really candid about our shortcomings. I think when you're doing this work, acknowledging that organized humanism is just historically and continually like older, paler, maler, informs how we work. And in some points that can be leveraged to be a really positive thing, right? But it's also something we just need to be really aware of when we're doing this work. And then I think, again, going back to the specifics really matter in this work, and our work has to be comprehensive. So the work our development does, when they put out an e-appeal, right, they're thinking through, how is this being inclusive? How are we representing our values? And so I think in a big way, the social justice department's work is being more candidly and overtly funded, resourced, spoken about in ways that's really helping other parts of the organization feed off of that work really positively. So I'll flag one more thing here, is that we have 4 social justice alliances. We have the LGBTQ Humanist Alliance, the Feminist Humanist Alliance, the Black Humanist Alliance, and I want to say now it's 2 years old, the Latinx Humanist Alliance. And when I started, they were advisory councils. So we would go to them, ask them for their input, which is a really important, wonderful kind of volunteer work that these folks were doing. But when you're doing social justice work, you really need to be following the lead of impacted communities. And I think in many ways, AHA headquarters should not be saying, oh, I think this issue is important, let's go do this. We really need to be following the lead. So since I've started, we are specifically budgeting for each alliance and following the lead of all these awesome projects that they've started, that we just execute the projects that they want to go work on. And I'm happy to talk more about those. And so I think our work has become much more specific. We're really down in the details about the work we're doing. An example is that the Latinx Humanist Alliance has really been concerned about how immigrant communities are impacted by COVID. And so they launched an advocacy campaign to ensure that all folks, regardless of immigration status, have access to testing and treatment for COVID, which is a very specific, discrete campaign in many ways, which hopefully has some chance of coming to fruition.
Yeah, so talk about the journey from advisory council, or what was it before? It was a board before, and now it's
advisory councils. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the workings of those groups, because we've had those brochures and and I've read that, but I don't know the people that are involved, and that's simply because I haven't looked. I suspect there's probably a good page on the AHA's website where that would be more described. But can you tell us a little bit about those groups? How do people get involved? Are you interested in rotating people through that group, et cetera?
So we are always looking for new council members. So each alliance is led by a leadership council. We made it more of an active name. And they determine kind of budget requests every year. What kind of work do we want to resource? And they are based all over the country. Another thing that we've done is that we've expanded all of those alliances, so you can just join and become a member and stay aware of the work that all of these alliances are doing. Each alliance has its own website, thefeministhumanists.org, LGBTQhumanists.org, et cetera, where you can see the projects that they're working on and get involved. And if you're interested in volunteering with a group or joining a leadership council, please, don't hesitate to reach out or check out their websites for more information. But I think they still serve really important roles as leadership councils. The AHA board passed 3 resolutions last year on social justice issues. They passed one on white supremacy, they passed one on gender-based violence, and they passed one on immigration. And those leadership council members were really critical in making sure that the final resolutions were as inclusive and equitable as possible.
Okay, that's great. I was looking for a place while you were talking to try to link people, but it looks like these are really independent sites, and there's not like a hub for them at AHA. Am I missing perhaps a social justice page at AHA, or are these going to be?
There is a page, and it is going to take me a second to find it, but I will.
Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be great, because I think that one of the things that I want to make sure we do today is kind of inform people about what our group is doing and not doing in this vein, and also how AHA is facilitating these opportunities for us. So if you're doing that, that would be great. I did put in the chat a few minutes ago, the color of law. Looks like the most recent version is 2017. So take a look for that. That's by Richard Rothstein. Does that sound like the right author for that?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, great. So I put that in the chat, and it's also got the smile tag in front of it. So if you're not supporting either the AHA or the Central Florida Freethought Community or another organization with your smile donations, please do that. Of course, I'm sure this book is available at other places if you're not shopping on Amazon. So did you find that yet?
I will find it. I think I went to the wrong page.
No problem.
a whole page with all our adjunct organizations.
Yeah, take your time and do that as long as you feel like you can do it in a couple of seconds there. I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but
I can talk while I look.
Okay, great. Well, then let me move on to another thought that I think popped up. So following the lead, when we talk about, doing activism at the local level, we find ourselves focused on that which we think we do best, which is separation of religion and government. And I think that makes sense because we do have advocates, or we are advocates for allied organizations in Central Florida and beyond that are doing things that are important to us and important to separation between church and state. And those are social justice organizations, right? So Planned Parenthood, Equality Florida, all types of groups that I don't have a list of here, that we find ourselves in the same spaces with the leaders and movers and shakers in those organizations. Those are the friends that we've made in the movement, and we've found our agnostic, atheist, and secretly humanist, non-theist friends in these groups. Because they're doing the work they're doing, they are there for a reason, right? They believe in it, and sometimes it speaks to their values, and sometimes those values are related to their non-theism, even if they're not out about it. So we have looked in many cases to those groups for advocacy, but honestly, I found it difficult to reach out cold to these groups from the Freethought community and say, hey, how can we be involved? When I reach out cold on the website, I get little or no response. But when I talk to the people at events that I'm at and become friends with, some of those people are actually in the state legislature now, that's worked out tremendously. So folks that are watching here, the work that the Central Florida Freethought community does is way more than an occasional Zoom event. It's building relationships in the community. And I wonder if things that we've done and things that we haven't even heard about yet could be useful across the country. Can you talk about how other groups are involved in these issues, other than supporting the alliances that I think looks like Alex found, and probably you did as well?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Alex, for putting that up there. So I think a lot of our chapters are doing a bunch of different work. And I think, unfortunately, Emily, our grassroots coordinator, would be better suited to talk about all the amazing things our chapters are doing. I think in terms of getting involved, I know a few chapters who are involved with showing up for racial justice again. And I thank Alex for flagging that, not to assume that all the folks listening in are all humanists or white, but I think the majority of our chapters are majority white. And so connecting with other white folks working on racial justice issues, right? And just showing up to a meeting. I think you're totally right. If you just cold email folks, you're not always gonna hear back, but just showing up at a meeting, I think, can go a really long way to figuring out where we can best be plugged in. Mm-hmm. I think, so we've got organizations working on that. We've got organizations that are raising money. I think, again, in terms of resourcing social justice, how can we raise funds and put our resources to places that really could benefit from it? There's a group in Oregon that's working in detention centers on the border, working at detention centers on the border to make sure that folks have legal aid and legal access as they're trying to come into the country. So I think just getting looped up and figuring out what you have to offer and where it can be best used is really important. And I think just continuing to do that locally. I really don't have that much to add to what you just said.
Yeah, and let's talk about it a little bit more. I mean, you may not have more to add, but I want to make sure that I think through it, because as we put together events, I mean, before the COVID era, right? When we put together events, we don't say, here are all the things going on in the community that should matter to you or do matter to most of you. I'd love to know more about, and maybe this is for a future follow-up or offline communication, is what can groups do to make that work the best? I'm not afraid of turning people off by posting all the events from these other groups, but it can become rather crowded in our stream of events. And it already is, because we're sharing a lot of events from a lot of organizations on our Facebook page, right? There's stuff every day. We're Zooming all the time now. But what can local groups do a better job of? And I realize this might be rhetorical in this vein when it comes to coordinating. And maybe are there some resources that could be applied that say, here's how you approach social justice organizations from the humanistic perspective, and not just justify your position in the issue to your members, but also get involved in actually doing it, right? I mean, there's so much coaching that I've that we have as a board have needed over the years, and I've really had a hard time finding when it comes to local organizations. AHA and FFRF and American Atheists, they want our members, they want our money, they want our support. But I want to make sure when it comes to social justice, we're doing more than just, this, which is initiated by us reaching out to you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? That doesn't mean to be a rant as much as a request.
No, I hear that. And I will certainly take that back to Emily and our team. But I do think that I think there's one thing you said that I think I've seen chapters and groups around the country be successful at, is instead of trying to do all the things, pick something that, a good chunk of members locally are engaged in, because if you show up with 20 people, it's going to be a lot more meaningful than showing up with one, right? I think one thing that I've seen a few groups do, and I'm speaking about DC now, I think this was DC, is volunteering at marches to hand out water or organize crowds. Time of COVID might not be the time to start doing this work, but we had a MLK parade that we knew needed volunteers, and just showing up with a whole bunch of folks to do registration kind of shows support and gets involved. That's not a great example of social justice activism, but it's a way to, I think, be involved collectively that I think has a lot more impact than connecting folks with all the resources. Because I think what you see in social justice organizing is if you give someone really broad options, they're not going to make a decision. But if you're saying, hey, we as a group are showing up at this event at this time, be there, be square, I think you see a higher percentage of folks.
More interest. And I think maybe that speaks to why there should be a quarterly or an annual emphasis, right? I mean, agencies do this when they emphasize, kind of regulations that they're working on in my line of work. And I think if we were to emphasize for this year, or this quarter or whatever, this type of work, that would be really helpful, because we're not going to find something that everybody wants to do. And I certainly know we're not going to become the new Planned Parenthood or the new, Equality Florida or the new local Black Lives Matter group. That's not going to happen, but we've got to connect people to those groups because they're already connected, right? We need to find out probably who's in our group that's connected and how to use that relationship. I think that's probably the answer that we need is the people that already know these things are happening, right? We're not in a vacuum here. We're working on these issues already. So we need to harvest that information from our participants already.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned there was some kind of specific projects that were going on within the alliances. Did one come to mind that you wanted to highlight? I think you might've mentioned the Latinx recent one, or was there something else that was going on that might be a good example of what they're doing besides telling you how to talk and act when it comes to these?
No, absolutely. So one thing that just came to mind is that the Latinx Humanist Alliance's campaign is targeting specific senators around the country, and one of those senators is Rubio. And so we're looking for someone to sign an op-ed to be placed in Florida supporting the campaign that we're working on with ACLU. So if anyone's interested in getting more involved with that, I'll put my email, or I don't know if David's already thrown folks my email, but I can put it in the chat in a little bit. So I think that campaign might be of interest to folks. The other thing there's actually, I'm going to flag way too many things for you, but I'll try to do it quickly. So the LGBTQ Humanist Alliance is hosting its second annual Centering the Margins Summit for LGBTQ humanists.
I just saw the email this week. Yep.
Oh, great. That's going to be October 17th. And we are doing everything we can to make a virtual event seem like a community building opportunity. So if anyone's interested in that, check out their website. And then the Feminist Humanist Alliance is also working on something that I think folks on this call might be interested in, which is that they are funding a number of grant programs targeting local groups. So local groups involved in mutual aid or COVID responses, there's grant applications that are really easy to fill out. Anyone working locally in their community on COVID response. They're also doing kind of an arts and activism grant that if you want to go hand out water bottles at a protest, the FHA will cover that expense as well. So they're really thinking about how do we inject resources into our community that are doing social justice themed work.
So yeah, something that just happened, and you just mentioned the Feminist Humanist Alliance, and I just connected that to AHA as we speak. A local freethinker and participant in our events, Lindsay Bridges, who many of folks that are paying attention here know, she put together a fundraiser and donation drive for personal protective equipment for teachers in Central Florida public schools only. That was an important factor for us. So that the Feminist Humanist Alliance donated to her donation drive and helped to fund that. So we're grateful for that. Our organization, Freedom from Religion Foundation, did as well. It's nice to know that AHA was a participant, although through a slightly different name, which is fine. We need the appearance of a whole bunch of different groups, but they actually are all under one umbrella, right? Okay, great. So the let's see. I think I had something else I was going to ask you about. So if you've got questions, please drop them into the chat. We've got another 10 minutes. If we get into something in the next 10 minutes, we're not going to rush off right at the top of the hour unless Rachel needs to. But we are winding down a little bit. I've talked about a lot of the things that I had here, but I do want to talk about dissent from social justice work, right? The slur SJW is something that I've been continuing with, and a lot of people have who are advocates for social justice. And I think, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I don't think it's a major factor, but any dissent is recognizable, right? Whether you're a professional football player or, you know, an idiot on the internet, whether your intentions are good, bad, or otherwise, dissent gets attention, particularly now when everybody's got a stage. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think in many ways dissent is healthy, right? I think as humanists, as skeptics, you know, First Amendment, freedom of speech, I think dissent is something that I'm never going to hope I would never shy away from. I think I spend I think in terms of nonprofit work, we have to prioritize. And I think our Here for Climate campaign does a good job of thinking about this is if we have limited resources, who are we trying to reach out to? We're not trying to change the minds of climate deniers, right? We're trying to speak directly to the folks who might absolutely believe in the climate crisis that we're in, but not see a way for them to get involved. And so I think I spend most of my time in that similar vein of folks who understand the importance of social justice work, but might not see an avenue for themselves in that kind of work. But I think to the dissenters, to the folks who call me a social justice warrior, I think I was called a social justice warrior just a week ago. I just shift my language in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of buzzwords, I think a lot of dissent, it puts a lot of focus on some very particular words or some very particular ideas like cancel culture. And so instead of talking about cancel culture, I might talk about holding people accountable, right? Like, what does accountability look like on the internet? So I think our language can also go a long way in trying to engage in those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that. And I think, you know, something that I was reminded of, it seems logical, but every once in a while you're like, oh yeah, we should have been doing that all along. And I don't remember when we were or weren't, but you know, like this event now and the event we had 2 weeks ago and the event we'll have 2 weeks from now, we don't expect, you know, all 2,000 of our email listers to join us. But we need to have a variety of things that matter to us as a group and highlight those things so people can pick and choose from the menu and find out what they like, right? We're not a hive mind. We're not all going to agree on a whole lot of things. I mean, we have the greatest conversations about the definition of atheism and humanism. So if we can't agree on those things, we're going to have to disagree on others. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think listening charitably, you know, speaking honestly, and reducing the fervency with which you speak when you step out of your lane, right?
Yeah.
And don't take the spotlight away from people who know things better than you. And I think we can all kind of be, you know, ignorant of when that is, but what we don't want to do is be apathetic to the values like that. And I think, you know, being corrected shouldn't be taken so seriously. But certainly we've got to respect the situations where you're in public and someone calls you out, right? And whether that's the celebrity on social media who may or may not deserve it or not, it goes very awry sometimes. So I think I had one more question here. I did want to commend you and others who may be involved in the communications. It's really helpful for local groups when we get a reminder to share things.
Good.
Because you know, we've got a wonderful board member, Marilyn, who is sharing on social media, and she's pulling from AHA and other places. And I think, you know, what I don't see enough of, and I don't forward all these because we've already got them covered, but what I don't see enough of from all groups is, hey, please remember to share this. And I think that I haven't seen the toolkit, and I think it might be Emily who sends that. I don't think I've seen the toolkit in the last few months, but I appreciate when there are social justice components of that. And it can't be that every month, but certainly a reminder to share things, will help. And I think that the more you can do to support chapters and affiliates in this vein, the more it'll come back to AHA as a benefit. So
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions. What else is on your mind before we go? Did you want to talk about the Center for Freethought Equality at all? Or is there anything else on your list of topics you want to hit today?
Yeah. So one, I'll say that Emily's working on the next toolkit, and it is
Great.
social justice focused.
All right, good.
We were just talking about that on Friday night. I think the other thing, there was something else I wanted to flag that you just mentioned, but now I'm hitting a blank. You mentioned the toolkits, reaching out to chapters,
Sharing.
Yeah, I'm happy to over communicate. I always feel like we send you too many emails. But I think, I know what I wanted to flag. I think, so one of the things that we're doing on racial justice, I didn't actually answer this question in the last 6 months. So 2 of our leadership council members, Diane and Krista, are working on putting together a pretty extensive series for individuals and groups on how we can educate ourselves and engage on racial justice issues. That will be starting in a few months. So keep your eye out for that if you're interested in having more of this conversation. Because I think coming at a place from learning, I try to be humble. Sometimes I might not be, but I think coming at all of this from a place of learning is absolutely right. And so I'm looking forward to participating in those as well.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I mentioned, or that it came to mind a few minutes ago, I didn't come back to, is we are fervent about things with which we're familiar, and when we start stepping into other lanes, it's hard to adjust that. It really is. I find myself when I'm talking about subjects and I'll get a question during Q&A, I have to remind myself that I don't have to have the answer, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if I've got the wrong answer, and we've got to be humble in that regard, and certainly reminders of that are important. I put your email in the chat so everybody can find that. We appreciate you joining us today. And I'll mention for folks on YouTube who can't see that chat, you can reach Rachel at rdeitch, D-E. Am I saying that right, by the way, Deitch?
It's Deitch.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've heard it said the other way, and I guess you haven't corrected or canceled anybody who said it. So you're polite that way. But so Rachel Deitch, it's RDEITCH at AmericanHumanist.org. And we're really grateful for your time today, and look forward to seeing more emails from you about social justice and how we can help from the fields here.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'll say the one thing you did mention, I'm not going to let this end quite yet, is that CFE membership is free, which I don't know if a lot of people realize. So if you're interested in learning more about our C4's work, I encourage you to go to their website, cfequality.org, and become a member.
Yeah, please do. The only way you can hear about things from them is by joining. There's laws around that type of information sharing and candidate endorsements and stuff. And so if you just join by giving your email, you become a member, and it doesn't cost you anything other than an occasional email. So keep up the great work, and we hope to see you in Florida when it's safe to have you down here.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks so much, David. Thanks, everyone.
You bet. So before we go, a quick reminder, we're continuing our meetup events, including Freethought Cafes and Secular Women events as Zoom meetings. And we just added a new one this month. That event is focused on Claremont. But of course, as you know, these events are online. So people in Claremont and the people in Winter Garden and the people in Oviedo and the people in Canada who are joining us all look like they're in the same place. So don't let that discourage you. But we do have a new event, and we're glad to have Juanita helping with that. All events are online, so you can join us from anywhere, no matter what that event title is. And the reason we started doing that was because we wanted to keep the field for those local events that were happening. We've been, kind of at home so long that we've lost a little bit of that, but it is nice to continue to see some of the same people joining all events, as well as some of the same people joining their local events. So that's why we're trying to hold on to those names for now, because we know we'll be back into the cafes and pubs soon. So to find out how to join us here online, go to meetup.com/CFL Freethought. Until next time, keep looking out for one another, not because someone told you so, because it's the humanist thing to do. Bye, everybody.